I'll make a start. It's just 3 minutes past 4. People will trickle in as I speak, and also Juvaria introduces the panel. Just want to say welcome to everyone um, to another one of our global webinars. This is the fourth in the second series of 6, and we're really pleased to have really a great lineup of speakers today. And as I said, Juvaria will introduce them and the theme in a moment. But we're continuing our sort of discussion really about some of the biggest interesting questions in world politics and some of the biggest sort of factors which drive world politics. And today we've obviously selected one of the most significant themes that is of interest today. And that is, if you like, is the character of the whole of the first series we had a couple of months ago, and of this one, and of the one we're planning in the autumn as well. And I guess what we're trying to do in the broader terms is we're kind of partly inspired by the decolonizing the curriculum kind of a theme and movement. And I think, and in equally positive ways, we're trying to sort of bring varied voices, diverse set of opinions, perspectives, empirical themes, methodologies, disciplines, people in different global locations, people of different demographic backgrounds, and so on. Because I think it's our belief, really, and it's been borne out by what we've seen, is that we actually learn a great deal from a variety of perspectives and backgrounds, analyzing the same big issues. And it's that combination that we bring together in any one panel, which makes the conversation so interesting, just because of that diversity and variety. So, and I think the second thing is, of course, that because we do operate in our kind of relatively small domains, sub-disciplines, disciplines, we attend the same old conferences with the same old people in the panels and so on, and the same issues and questions and perspectives, that I think we often lose, which may be very good for careerism, but actually it doesn't necessarily explain a great deal about how the world actually works, and that we learn a great deal more about how the world works, which I would think is the object of our scholarship, by learning from different perspectives, disciplines, and backgrounds, and so on. So that's the idea behind these global webinars. So as I say, we've assembled a group of 4 really interesting presenters today, and I'm going to hand over to Juvaria, my collaborator in organizing these panels, to introduce the theme and the guest speakers today.
Right, thank you, Inderjeet. So as you know, today's session is about white supremacy and racial capitalism in world politics. We've seen from recent movements, for instance, and particularly the Black Lives Matter movement, that there's been a lot of attention drawn to how issues such as police brutality and other systemic forms of violence and marginalization not only emerge from notions of white supremacy, but are an integral feature of capitalism. Scholars and activists have used the term racial capitalism to explain an overarching system in which whiteness becomes crucial to facilitating economic growth. Now, what are the implications of this on an international scale? How can we think about concepts like racial capitalism and white supremacy in the context of world politics? For this, we have gathered virtually an impressive group of scholars who I will introduce now. We have with us Robert Vitalis, who is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and has written numerous articles on American foreign policy, the Middle East, and also energy policy. He is the author of 4 books for which he has received several awards. His first book is When Capitalists Collide, Business Conflict and the End of Empire in Egypt. This was published in 1995, and he continued to develop and expand the scope of his interests in historical comparative analysis in his second book, which is America's Kingdom, Myth-Making on the Saudi Oil Frontier. This was published in October 2006 by the Stanford University Press. And he also has a third book, White World Order, Black Power Politics, published in 2016 by the Cornell University Press. In this, he moves away from the Middle East to explore the unwritten history of international relations scholarships in the United States, including those African-American thinkers that challenge the discipline's racist and imperialist commitments. And his most recent book is called Oilcraft, The Myths of Scarcity and Security That Haunt US Energy Policy, also published by Stanford University Press in 2020. And I'm also very pleased to introduce our second speaker, Bobby Banerjee, who is also one of my PhD supervisors and is Professor of Management and the Associate Dean of Research and Enterprise at Bayes, formerly known as CAS Business School at City University of London. His primary research interests are in the areas of corporate social responsibility, sustainability, climate change and resistance movements, indigenous ecology, and post-colonial studies. He's published extensively in leading scholarly journals. He's the author of 2 books, Corporate Social Responsibility, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and also the co-edited volume, Organizations, Markets, and Imperial Formations Towards an Anthropology of Globalization. He is on the editorial board of 7 international journals. He's a senior editor at Organization Studies, was between 2007 to 2019, sorry, and is an associate editor at Business and Society. We also have with us Zophia Edwards, assistant professor at Providence College, Rhode Island, in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Dr. Edwards' research examines the impacts of colonialism and multiracial labor movements on state formation and human development in the global South, with a particular focus on resource-rich countries. Her work has been published in various journals. It covers the areas of comparative historical sociology, sociology of development, post-colonial sociology, labor and labor movements, and race and racism. We also have with us Srdjan Vucetic, who is an associate professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs and the research coordinator at the Center for International Policy Studies at the University of Ottawa. His research interests are international hierarchy, foreign and defense policy analysis, and the arms trade. He has held fellowships at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore, the Institute for Security and Defense Analysis in New Delhi, and at Pembroke College at the University of Cambridge. Thank you all for joining us today.
Okay, great. Thank you. Zophia, if you're happy, please, could you start us off?
Thank you so much, Juvaria and Inderjeet, for compiling this wonderful panel. I'm really excited for the conversation and the questions. And thank you so much for reaching out to me, Juvaria. I think it was on Twitter. It was nice to have these avenues to organize these kinds of events. I just want to start off by saying that I want to just take a moment to acknowledge all of the lives that have been taken by the pandemic, COVID-19, and also the other pandemics that are occurring concurrently, and that to proclaim that Black lives do matter. On March 12th, 2020, the first COVID-19 case was reported in Trinidad and Tobago. The government immediately instituted a range of public health measures and prohibited entry into the country for both nationals and non-nationals. 2 weeks later, a stay-at-home order was adopted. The government acted early. It contained and closed schools, workplaces, public events, offered economic support to citizens, and engaged in a vigorous public health information campaign. And people largely cooperated. The response was so strong that by May 2020, a report by Oxford University ranked Trinidad and Tobago as the #1 response to the pandemic in the world. That May, they decided that restrictions could be slightly eased. People started going back out to work, but some measures remained in place, including masks, no gatherings, and so on. For an entire year, actually over a year, Trinidad and Tobago managed to contain the spread of the virus and minimize the number of fatalities. And then suddenly this month, May 2020, the number of new cases and deaths skyrocketed to terrifying proportions. The highly contagious P1 variant had entered the country. People are fatigued, staying at home and isolating. Hospitals have now become overwhelmed. Pop-up tent clinics had to be constructed to house the overflow of COVID-19 cases. The proportion of new cases in the population in late April, early May matches the rates in India that we have been seeing on the news. We don't see Trinidad and Tobago on the news. And the deaths per million far exceeds what is being reported out of India. So how did it go from being such a top performer to being in such dire straits in such dramatic fashion? Trinidad and Tobago is not unique though, right? Most of the peripheralized world is struggling to get a grip on the pandemic. People, and predominantly Black people in countries like Brazil that have been suffering since the start of the pandemic are continuing to suffer. And people in countries that initially did well to contain the virus and minimize the loss of life are now beginning to experience these dramatic spikes in new cases and deaths. So at a meeting of the World Health Organization back in February of this year, when Trinidad and Tobago and other peripheralized countries were trying to get vaccines, while North American and European countries were overordering and stockpiling vaccines, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Keith Rowley, said, "History is littered with instances of destructive behavior, disrespectful dominance, imbalances, and other forms of man's inhumanity to man. But on this rare occasion, when we are all yoked to an invisible destroyer, it is my hope and plea that when the journal of this experience is written, it would deviate from what is mostly the norm and record, that on this occasion, the rich take care of the poor, and the small and impecunious are not trampled with disdain by those who could have done so simply because they had the wherewithal to do it." The preservation of white lives in the core being prioritized above all others begs the question, while there was a race for the vaccine, which race will be vaccinated? So this COVID-19 pandemic has brought into sharp relief the deep structural problems affecting racialized workers in the core and in the periphery. Yet so many of our social scientific analyses of the global political economy, at least in the pre-COVID era, remain race neutral or willfully indifferent to the fact that global inequalities bear a distinct racial pattern. Even if they do address the legacies of colonialism, they ignore the ongoing racial logics of oppression embedded therein. So in this brief discussion, I just want to explore how peripheralized countries have fared in this pandemic and why the current model of this COVID-19 response is unsustainable in a global racial capitalist system. I'm going to argue that due to this enduring racist and colonial architecture of global racialized capitalism, peripheralized economies remain tethered to the global political economy in ways that put them in a position of extreme dependency on international markets and international exchange, and make them exceptionally vulnerable to becoming crippled by COVID-19. So in linking racism and colonialism in this way, I'm sort of returning to these scholars, the Black radical scholars, who predated and actually, in fact, it laid the institutional foundations for what later becomes dependency on world systems theory. And so throughout this COVID-19 pandemic, we see capitalist, imperialist exploiters further intensifying relations of domination upon non-white racialized populations in the periphery. And they have done so by the super exploitation of racialized labor, vaccine hoarding, and other protectionist trade measures, and COVID-19 related loans. So I'll talk about each of those in turn, but I do want to spend some time just briefly mentioning sort of this Black radical tradition. So still very much on the margins, you know, in our various disciplines, but we have seen a recent surge in that the use of that term racial capitalism, right? Which first was developed by South Africans and made popular by Cedric Robinson. But this overarching framework of racial capitalism dates far back to the early 20th century radical thinkers like Esther Cooper Jackson and W.E.B. Du Bois. And racial capitalism refers to the mutually constitutive entanglements of racialized exploitation, colonial domination, and capital accumulation. According to this framework, capitalism as we know it today would not have been possible if not for imperialism, colonialism, racial slavery, expropriation, and super exploitation. And capital accumulation today would not be possible if not for these ongoing logics. So these theories maintain that capital and capitalist states secure profit maximization, not by rendering labor abstract, as Marx theorized, but by tying profits to what Lisa Lowe called the social production of difference, which includes race, gender, and nationality. And this tradition prefigured dependency and world systems theory by elucidating how imperialism and colonization created a system of unequal exchange where the periphery is impoverished as it supplies cheap and enslaved labor and raw materials that enrich the core. But they add that racism structures this exploitation of workers, right? So that neither the induction to work nor the surplus value created by all workers is the same. In doing so, they specify why capitalist exploitation is more intensive and brutal for workers of color. So I'm trying to take this long arc of sort of this racial capitalist system through sort of when capitalism emerged to try to understand what the situation we are in currently. So with labor, the pandemic has exacerbated the already existing racial inequalities that undergird the global economy. I wrote about this in a piece recently in Monthly Review about how capital accumulation persisted throughout the pandemic via the intensification of the super exploitation of workers racialized as non-white, both in the core and around the world. But capital and states have deemed Black and brown labor essential to maintaining profits. Core countries are calling upon Black and brown people both within their countries and in the periphery to ensure continued production and profits in almost every realm, from food production, where, for instance, in the US, 43% of farm and processing workers are immigrants, and many are not US citizens, to the healthcare sectors, where immigrants comprise 16% of healthcare practitioners and 22% of healthcare support. And these are also predominantly women, right, from Asia, the Caribbean, Central America, South America, and Africa. In the services sector, including transportation, healthcare support, food preparation, cleaning and maintenance, non-white racialized workers were required to continue working. These were also the industries with the largest layoffs, no doubt contributing to the 7% decline in global remittances to people in low and middle income countries during 2020. And just to a reminder, some countries are exceedingly dependent on remittances. So it is these very people, particularly African and African descended populations, already living under the weight of centuries of white supremacy and structural racism, who are disproportionately dying from the disease. It's no surprise that that's happening in this structure. So we can also understand then how states are responding, especially in the core, which have engaged in programs to preserve the system and protect the interests of capital. So for instance, relief and welfare programs in the US and the UK have not targeted the most vulnerable. In fact, they've deliberately sought to exclude brown, indigenous, Black, people of color, citizens, and especially non-citizens from being able to access relief. So racial capitalism highlights on whose back wealth continues to be generated during this pandemic. Through trade as well, we see global trade as a whole has contracted during the pandemic, hitting peripheralized countries the hardest. On a whole, merchandise trade dropped about 5.3%, according to WTO figures, with Africa and the Middle East recording drops of 8%. Countries that are eager to re-stimulate extraction and production and trade as they are desperate for national income. But without vaccinations, how tenable is such a plan? Can economies, for instance, that depend on tourism, truly open back up for business in the age of COVID in the way that they had in the past? What does this mean for workers in peripheralized countries that depend on revenue from export processing zones? And for countries that depend on natural resource exploitation, when due to the reduced international demand, commodity prices have plummeted in spectacular fashion. Vaccine hoarding and North American European protectionism in this crisis is both risking human lives in the periphery directly and through the economic fallouts of the pandemic. Core countries, as we've heard, have ordered vaccines far in excess of what they need and are reluctant to share their stockpiles, leaving the rest of the world to suffer. Of the 1.5 billion doses administered so far, up to this month, 60% of those have been administered in 20 wealthy countries, and only 0.3% has gone to low-income countries. But this is just an extension of what these countries were doing for centuries, and also earlier on in this pandemic, right, where core countries instituted protectionist measures to hoard medical supplies. So in the US, Trump, for instance, invoked the US Defense Production Act to limit exports of medical supplies and increase the production of ventilators. This act was originally passed in 1950 to hoard supplies and equipment during the Korean War. But now it extends beyond the military to cover natural disasters and national emergencies. So it orders domestic businesses to prioritize federal contracts and incentivizes domestic industries to increase production and supply of goods and materials. Biden followed Trump in January to divert materials needed to manufacture the vaccine to domestic producers, and such as Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson. So many manufacturers in other countries like India were unable to get the raw materials that they needed to make the vaccine, only for Biden to turn around in April after the virus has spread to millions of Indians and say they're going to, quote unquote, help India out in its time of need. So not only are they hoarding vaccines, but they're actively preventing manufacturers in the periphery from sourcing the materials needed to produce more. North American governments, European governments, and private corporations are also wielding much needed life-saving vaccines over countries in an attempt to extract from the periphery. There is large variation in the cost of vaccines, with peripheralized countries paying far more than North American and European countries. For instance, it is $3, according to one report, it is $3.50 per dose for countries in the European Commission, and it is $8.50 per dose for Uganda. There is an alliance called COVAX, which is a group of 190 countries, which is aimed at collectively buying the vaccine from manufacturers and then distributing them in an equitable fashion according to the size of the population. But COVAX is unable to get the vaccines as wealthy nations have bought up the majority on their own, thereby undercutting global efforts at equitable vaccine distribution. And I'll also just mention Aishu Balaji has written about this web of conflicting interests involving some of the major partners within COVAX, which include the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So we should read more about that. But furthermore, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism revealed that Pfizer is strong-arming peripheralized nations in vaccine negotiations, demanding, for instance, that Brazil and Argentina put up sovereign assets, such as federal bank reserves, embassy buildings, military bases, and so on, as a guarantee against the cost of future legal cases stemming from unlikely adverse effects. Another mechanism through which the periphery is being super exploited is through foreign loans and debt. Peripheralized countries need financing to fight against the pandemic itself and also the economic and social fallouts. The crisis hit at a time when many of these economies were already struggling with unsustainable debt burdens. But the IMF has been tying COVID-related loans to austerity measures. So one Oxfam analysis found that 76 out of 91 IMF loans negotiated with 81 countries since March 2020 push for decreases in public spending, which means decreases in public health expenditure and social protections and welfare programs. Barbados and Lesotho, for instance, are likely to freeze or cut public sector wages. In Ecuador, the IMF advised that the government backtrack on increases in healthcare spending. So the IMF is calling for countries that take these loans also to implement green recovery plans, which include that the public investments must go towards renewable energies, but renewable energy technology from where? At a time when we should be discussing debt cancellation, this is not on the table. G20 economies have allowed the most heavily indebted countries to suspend bilateral payments for a period of time, but debt cancellation has not been a part of the discussion. So just to briefly wrap this up, because I'm out of time. The people in the periphery are suffering, but it's not just that because they happen to be Black or brown or indigenous. Racial capitalism helps to explain what is facilitating this inequality on a global scale. These structures of exploitation are actively maintained through a global system of white supremacy. Du Bois shows us that white populations have historically not stood in solidarity with racialized colonized populations. According to the white supremacist ideology that prevails, they seek to maintain their public and psychological wages of whiteness, i.e., the higher social status or sense of superiority from being categorized as not Black. So white workers in the middle and working classes have, to quote Du Bois, adopted, forwarded, and approved this system. They did it with Brexit. They did it with the election of Trump. A barely passing victory for Biden. And so to quote Du Bois again, this has resulted in the subordination of colored labor to white profits the world over. So why is it important to use racial capitalism as we study this crisis? Well, of course, first, people's lives are at risk. And not all people are suffering equally. So this framework, this theoretical and analytical framework increases our explanatory power and our predictive power, both in terms of how this pandemic would and has played out and how the vaccine rollout is playing out. Dependency of peripheralized countries on the core is being entrenched, and Black and brown workers in the core and periphery are being more negatively exploited and impacted. And so therefore, that fact would improve our response if we want to save life. So we must address these entanglements of both racism and colonialism in the constitution of the global political economy, or we will be right back here again in the next pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zophia. That's a really sobering and very interesting and informative discussion that you've inaugurated there as well, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. Just want to remind the audience that you can use the Q&A function to start typing in your questions, which we can then later on relay to our speakers as well. So thank you, Zophia. Okay, so we move on to our second speaker, Professor Robert Vitalis. Over to you, Bob.
Thank you so much, folks. I'm going to move us in what I hope is a complementary direction. Okay. I think it's great to be here. And by here, I mean at my home, but still seeing you all. I believe why I got invited in the first place is due to a book I wrote in 2015, White World Order, Black Power Politics. In it, I sought to upend the story that professors of international relations in the United States tell about themselves. And instead, I demonstrate in the book how deeply entangled the discipline was in the imperialism that constituted world order in the 20th century and arguably until now, and the racism that infected all quarters of American life. Now, while I didn't draw attention to it, in the conclusion, as I wrestled with the implications of a book about the professors for our world today and the world beyond the ivory tower, I was previewing arguments for 2 more books, and I've just come out with the first of them. Oilcraft, or the myths of scarcity and security that haunt US energy policy. And what I want to do here is show how, when it comes to oil in international relations, racism remains the unrecognized component of the strategic thought of most action-oriented intellectuals and the policy makers they dream of influencing. And it turns out to be as true as well for their chief antagonists, for lack of a better term. That is, those critics on the left who believe that the United States somehow commands the globe by its military presence in the Persian Gulf. So first I'll explain the title of the book and main argument, and then trace how racism matters. Now, you might hear that term oilcraft and think it's a variant on statecraft, one that recognizes the centrality of oil to national security, US power, and the like we're always arguing. But I don't mean it that way. Rather, I mean it as an analog to witchcraft. After all, European and American men of science once believed in witches. But you also might think this analogy is outrageous and unfair. So let's try another example. Let's take race. The puzzle for Karen and Barbara Fields, shown here, is how and why the scientifically discredited idea persists that humans are naturally divided into distinct groups, identifiable by certain physical and other traits. Racecraft is the term the Fields coined for what they call the rational processes of meaning making that make race appear to the mind and imagination as a vivid truth. And they argue the terrain of these false beliefs exists and can be analyzed both on their own terms and, importantly, in terms of the work these ideas do, that is, their effects. So Oilcraft argues that what is true about the idea of race and its relationship to the mental terrain of racecraft is true as well about the magical properties that oil, an ordinary commodity, accrues as it transits through oilcraft territory. That is, widespread popular beliefs about oil as power and the putative need, let alone the ability to secure access or stabilize prices or prevent hostile powers from holding the world economy hostage. These have no basis in fact. Evidence for the belief, such as it is, continues to accumulate in the form of US officials, past and present, proclaiming about these things, and starting in 1979, shifting the US military presence from Southeast Asia to the Persian Gulf. The anti-imperialist left takes these claims, and these claims alone at face value, in comparison, say, to when a government proclaims its commitment to democracy promotion, which is always just seen as a rationale for something else. Why? Because they seemingly confirm their own deep-rooted beliefs in big oil, or as they say now, fossil capital's needs, and about how the US exerts its hegemony over its would-be capitalist rivals. Only nothing the policymakers, armed with these incantations, have done can be shown to have kept those allies in line, or made the price of petroleum more stable than other commodities, or have secured for refiners greater quantities at lower prices than had the same policymakers refrain from doing all the things we believe have been done in its name. As the Fields argue, real actions create evidence for the imagined thing and constantly dumps factitious evidence for itself in the real world. Now, a mistake that most historians who write about the international politics of oil in the 20th century make is that in the 1920s and 1950s, statesmen and their varied ventriloquists among the intellectuals of the day and so forth, well, they fretted about access to or control of all sorts of raw materials. This idea would make perfect sense to Inderjeet because he's written about the Korean War, and in the Korean War, arguments about the need for access to raw materials, dominated discourse in the United States. Scholars, though, today are barely aware of how radically they recast the past in order to tell the stories about the only commodity that seems to matter now. In oilcraft, I return to those past debates about the so-called laws that statesmen and other engineers of empire back then said compelled the pursuit of control of raw materials of all sorts, else suffer the alleged consequences. Much about that era has been forgotten, not least the critics who had begun to challenge what they called the bogeys, phantoms, and mirages behind the new imperialism and the pathological nationalism of the era with its impossible dreams of self-sufficiency. Now, while there's much to say about the illiberal and/or neo-mercantilist strands in geopolitical thought, what I want to focus on is the racism, not least because racism wasn't recognized as such at the time. In the 1920s, whites evinced great fear that their days were numbered. They faced an existential threat, they said, from the so-called darker and inferior peoples of the world. Here's the cover of a best-selling book from 1920, one that appears very much of the moment, in fact. Only this was not the views of a fringe at the time, as it is today, but what passed for common sense in the universities, the press, and in politics generally. Another widely read book at the time, The White Man's Dilemma, describes the problem in a nutshell. Whites needed the raw materials found in Africa and Asia, but would not be able to continue to control them without use of force. Why? Because, as many insisted, a fanatical fear and hatred of the West allegedly drove the Asiatics, Mohammedans, and brown and yellow races on their quixotic quest for self-determination. What I want to draw our attention to is a wrinkle in the familiar arguments we all make in our lectures about imperialism, say about the civilizing missions and the white man's burden, because we miss one. That is, in post-World War I, defenders of the imperial order began to insist that the raw materials found in the tropics and semi-tropics were by right the heritage of mankind. I'm quoting Frederick Lugard, the former governor of Nigeria, and this is how he framed the problem in his dual mandate in British tropical Africa. The races, he said, that inhabited these places possessed no right to deny the bounties to those who need them. The raw materials were essential to the very existence of the races of the temperate climes. Sure, he argued, we could do a better job protecting the interests of the inhabitants, but they could not be permitted to exert a spurious sovereignty over the resources themselves. Now, these same arguments were taken up by US defense intellectuals and others in the Cold War in response to the independence wave gaining ground in Asia and Africa. The father of containment, George Kennan, embraced the heritage of mankind idea and said that Venezuelans and others had no rights over resources since they had not moved the finger to create the wealth and were incapable of developing it themselves. This was the default view of those who sought to rehabilitate the imagined science of geopolitics. That science ostensibly revealed why colonialism had to be preserved and how NATO might step in to take over from Britain, France, Belgium, and Portugal for a better, and I kid you not, reading from the documents at the time, for what they called a happier colonialism going forward. Subject peoples would finally recognize that their natural resources were truly a trust for the world. Now, if one considers these hard-headed geopolitical truths to be self-evident, that then it must be the case, as indeed was argued over and over again, that the problem was the irrational, mad, double-dealing, fanatical, hateful, etc. nature of the leaders of anti-colonial movements in newly independent countries, including but by no means limited to Mossadegh in Iran, Sukarno in Indonesia, Nasser in Egypt, Nehru in India, Ben Bella in Algeria, Qasim in Iraq, Sihanouk in Cambodia, Nkrumah in Ghana, Jagan in Guyana, and Lumumba in the Congo. Now, here's the problem. Of course, none of the militants none of the militant realists, as I call them, none of their apocalyptic visions, which they write about over and over again, of Europe's coming collapse, of new brutal wars of conquest, and not least the irreplaceable loss of those vital raw materials, came true. The fears of what I call the raw materialists proved unfounded. So what did they get wrong? A great deal, in fact, but most basically, economic nationalism, including the expropriation and nationalization of Western holdings in mineral production, plantation agriculture, and the like, did not mean the end of export production. Far from it. Industrializing countries needed the foreign exchange revenues from raw material exports to pay for the Western capital goods and technologies, which they would use to build domestic textiles, steel, automobile, pharmaceuticals, and weapons industries. And the main examples of the loss of raw material exports to the Western markets occurred only when the United States imposed or went along with embargoes. For instance, on Iranian oil in the early 1950s, or Cuban sugar after Castro's revolution. Needless to say, the United States is at it still, although all these sanctions levied around the world are never described as an assault on the world economy, as folks did say when Iranians filed missiles at Saudi oil facilities last year. Americans, though, suffered a kind of national trauma in 1973 as the world experienced the oil price revolution, when decision power shifted from the private oil companies to the oil producing states, and the companies' assets were taken over and nationalized over time. That is when all the hand-wringing about the need to control raw materials of all kinds ceases. And instead, the past gets rewritten as if it had always been one raw material alone, the prize that drove the struggle for wealth and power. The racism, though, survived intact. For instance, as when the Washington Post wrote that King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, who led the wholly ineffectual Arab, not oil embargo of the West, an OPEC oil embargo never took place, but we write that it did all the time. Nonetheless, the Washington Post called Faisal, said Faisal had done more damage to the West than anyone since Hitler. Or when the Shah of Iran, who happily took US market share from Saudi Arabia, and during that so-called embargo, sold all the oil the United States wanted or needed at the high prices prevailing on the spot market. Well, the Shah was described how? Insane by Treasury Secretary William Simon. The racism was and is palpable in the campaign by militant right thinkers and think tanks to seize Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and so forth in the 1970s in order to reverse the imagined blow to the West. The representation of the producing countries in those years was subject to a baseless double standard. All the time you see it described as crime, racket, piracy, and price hijack in place of the paternalism that once was the convention. Now, even those who argued against seizing an oil field or two, save as a last resort, such as Daniel Yergin, making his very first tentative foray into the topic in the New York Times Magazine in 1975, he condemned the oil price shock as unjust, when the reality is that the oil producers had seen the value of their only export and source of wealth decline with the end of Bretton Woods, the devaluation of the dollar, and the inflated costs of Western capital and consumer goods. What the relative price rise of that decade actually represents is their efforts, the producers' efforts at staying even. Okay? Now, the right reached for the common heritage of mankind idea again in the 1970s, but by then the histories had been forgotten, and we find scholars imagining it as a new idea. We also find various folks trying to breathe new life into it again during the 1990s, when political scientists were talking about failed states and advocating varieties of neo-trusteeship arrangements. And of course, we still find armchair strategists today clinging to the madman imaginary of a Saddam Hussein or Osama bin Laden or some other dictator holding the world's energy supply somehow hostage or raising its price, or otherwise acting in defiance of markets. The geopoliticians refuse to understand that oil is increasingly just another commodity, essentially similar to cocoa, tin, and pigs' bellies. By the way, I'm quoting Douglas Feith there. And Feith was one of the neoconservative architects of the Bush administration's 2003 invasion of Iraq. And we know that Feith's view about oil simply being accessible via the market was in fact the conventional wisdom of the White House at the time. That's what journalists have taught us. Of course, the left thinks something quite different, convinced that the US state acts in the Persian Gulf, in Iraq, and across the global South in the interest of big oil or fossil capital and so forth. Their racism is different. Back in the 1970s, and in fact until now, the argument was that the Saudis and other producers couldn't possibly have engineered the price revolution. And that in reality, it was the Western oil firms pulling the strings, a view that we still find in the press today. They see the Saudis in any other oil producing country that is an ally rather than an enemy of the United States as puppets doing the hegemon's bidding. The left today is also where we are most likely to find arguments about oil or carbon or energy being part of, yep, you got it, the common heritage of mankind, while unaware that the argument originates with the arch-imperialist Lord Lugard. Instead, they tell a strangely depoliticized story about the norm originating in the 1960s with the Maltese diplomat Arvid Parto and his longtime collaborator Elizabeth Mann Borghese, who advanced it in the context of UN Conference on the Law of the Sea. Now, the funny thing is that folks then were still aware of how the past impinged on the present. Take most famously the Algerian jurist Mohamed Bedjaoui, who advised the revolutionary Algerian government and was a key figure in the negotiations over the ill-fated new international economic order. While embracing the norm or trying to move it forward in the context of the law of the sea, he was smart enough to realize and to warn explicitly about the threat of co-optation, the danger in moving in this direction. As he said, what is yours is ours, and what's ours is our own. That seems to be the disquieting slogan of the well-off states in their dealings with the developing countries. Well, 50 years later, it is important that defenders of the idea recognize the parochial, illiberal, and imperial dimensions of the common heritage of mankind. The same is true, by the way, of the kindred idea of the tragedy of the commons, first proposed by environmentalist Gareth Hardin in 1968. Hardin himself was a white supremacist and champion of eugenics. So to sum up, and as Erin Pineda has argued recently and more generally, the conceptual underpinnings of the global racial order continue to live within the concepts that structure our fields, though they are often taught, discussed, and debated as if they had little to do with race. Now, why does this matter? Well, the short answer is that by omission or commission, the majority of the world's population that is not yet part of advanced post-industrial society face the prospect yet again of not counting, or at least not counting as much in the dreams of reconciling sustainability and well-being represented by the Green New Deal and other, quote, false visions of surefire solutions for climate change. As Joshua Goldstein and Steven Pinker have shown, Western activists who seek to overthrow the fossil fuel regime would do so even if many billions of people in the global South will have to bear the costs for a variant of an old story. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. That was so interesting. And I'm looking forward to reading your book, actually, in the near future. So thank you so much. We move now to our third speaker, Srdjan Vucetic from the University of Ottawa. So Srdjan, you have, I see your slides already started, so please, you have about 18 minutes or so. to make your
Thanks very much. Yes, thank you, Juvaria, as well. This is a huge pleasure for me for many reasons. Inderjeet and I were talking about this before the start. When we meet first, and I think it was at the 2011 ISA Montreal conference. So we had a global racism panel, and Bob Vitalis was there, and we had two people in the audience, and both of those people became really good friends of mine. So now the audiences are much bigger, and I'm always hoping if the law of transitivity applies, I'll make more friends as I go along. So today I want to talk about the role white supremacy plays in two hegemonic contestations that I believe are defining the world today. One involving China and the West, and one involving rival ideological positions within and across nations. I'll focus on the U.S. The U.S. will be my stand-in for the West, but obviously it's just an illustration. These contestations, I argue, are distinct. They involve multiple and often conflicting forces and groups, but they're also sometimes intertwined and mutually reinforcing in ways that are perhaps ironic. A case in point, I suggest, is an emerging coalition, discursive and otherwise, between authoritarian states such as China on one hand and the Western radical right on the other. So let's start with this much trafficked editorial from February 2021. It was a response to Canada's House of Commons passing of a non-binding motion accusing Beijing of committing genocide against Uyghurs. Global Times is known as the, I guess, the mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party. China's angriest newspaper is how we call it in the West. And editorial suggested that by resisting the Five Eyes alliance, which it called a mafia-styled geopolitical bloc, China is doing the world a service. So it's not just defending its national interests, but also the world's diversity. And so on one level, you can say, well, this is just typical whataboutism trolling routinely practiced by China's English language media. But more fundamentally, such media campaigns are part of a long-standing tactic that China and other authoritarian states use to manipulate, or as we call today, weaponize a liberal democratic openness to information and debate. And Chinese diplomats do this all the time. Just yesterday, Foreign Minister Wang Yi at the Munich Security Conference webinar said, there's no such thing as genocide in Xinjiang. Besides, I quote, our European friends know what is genocide. He was talking in Munich. And so this happens all the time. Spokesperson for the said Ministry of Foreign Affairs is constantly on Twitter, which is banned in China, talking about how the US is the most Islamophobic nation in history, providing evidence for that claim, as well as showing pictures of life in Xinjiang, how wonderful it is. So when did this start? I mean, on one level, this is a grotesque diplomatic language. So when did it start? Well, by my count, I mean, maybe I'll display some everyday nationalism on my Canadian part. It started in 2018. So this is the case of the two Michaels, as we call them in Canada, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spauer. They are on trial in China on espionage charges, and they were kidnapped and detained in 2018 in retaliation for Canada's detention of an executive of the telecoms giant Huawei, Meng Wanzhou, who's wanted in the US on fraud charges. I think you know this story really well. What you might not know is that China's ambassador at the time, Liu She, wrote an op-ed in an Ottawa newspaper, the Hill Times, asserting that the babble from Canada about the rule of law is just simply a function of the double standards. And these double standards are rooted in, as he argued, Western egotism and white supremacy. So what you see here is Chinese academics, state officials, journalists, others, lambasting Western governments as agents of white supremacy, and what this in IR is recognized as a global battle for the hearts and minds. I guess the technical term is norm contestation. There are usually different rhetorical forms rubrics that we assign to this type of practice. Rhetoric of white supremacy is part and parcel of it now. And it's meant to expose liberal hypocrisies and double visions in order to make liberal modernity, not in order to make liberal modernity more liberal or anything like that, but to undermine Western claims to moral authority, right? And to simply stop the Westerners from setting the agenda on good governments. Part of this rhetoric is also an exercise of what we might call civilizational essentialization, which is a Huntingtonian practice of dividing the world into discrete and distinct civilizations. So China versus the Anglo-Saxon Five. Again, this is to undermine liberalism. So let's talk about responses. So what are the responses? Well, they're very interesting. In the UN itself, you got two types of responses. So here on the right, you see the Canadian UN Ambassador Bob Rae, a longtime Canadian politician, who in October gave a much trafficked, off-the-cuff response to some of these accusations. And the response has been, yeah, we know our history is flawed, but we're doing something about this, right? Where are the Truth and Reconciliations Commissions of China and Syria? And so that made a lot of Canadians happy. Another equally effective, I would say, response has been coming from the Biden-Harris administration. And here you have Linda Thomas-Greenfield, US UN ambassador, and she's even better. She says, yeah, we know about white supremacy. We've been fighting it for a very long time here in this country. And our job is to leave said country in better condition than we found it. We're making progress. And this is not just the ambassador. Even State Secretary Lloyd J. Austin this week made the same point, I think in a West Point speech. And so where does this come from? Well, you know, if you did a quick genealogy, obviously this would take you back straight to early years of the Cold War. And here you see a pamphlet that was issued by the US State Department to the Voice of America, in which advice was given to journalists to I guess, exalt progress made by Black elites in the United States as proof that America's democracy worked. It was published in 1952. So, you know, the left usually knows how to read this type of stuff, as Bob was talking about earlier. We see this similar liberal response in, I guess, liberal newspapers. Here's an example of a column written by a longstanding columnist in the newspaper formerly known newspaper of globalization, the Financial Times. And this is a direct response to that Global Times editorial. And what Ratman says is, yes, you know, we have to take this seriously. These accusations might not like the word white supremacism, but we have to take it seriously. Why? Because evidence points to the fact that the white order is crumbling internationally, and we have a new Cold War to win. And so we need a new project for the new American century, if you like. And you know, this should be our strategy for winning the battle of hearts and minds, anti-racism, right? And quote, he says, the long-term goal is to contrast the multicultural United States with the ethnocentric China. And you know, you could also find this in history. Quick genealogy suggests that, yes, it's true. The West did use precisely this strategy in the 1960s. China tried to cast the Cold War as a racial war, and that failed for various reasons. I can get into them maybe in the Q&A a little bit. And Bob wrote on this in 2009, the Midnight Ride of Nkrumah and Other Fables of Bandung. It's a really good piece. So that was the response of the liberals. So what about the conservatives, you say? Well, this is where it gets interesting. Let's look at the Murdoch media first. How did they respond to that Global Times editorial? Well, exactly like you think they responded. They said this is Beijing using progressive rhetoric to attack Western interests. The woke Chinese Communist Party, using the dismissive term used to deride campaigns against racism and other isms. And so they say, you know, maybe in the 1960s, the left had a point, but they don't have that point now. They're engaging in empty rhetoric, and they don't realize that they're being useful idiots to Beijing. And I like this quote: Global Times editors may be crude, but they've obviously been reading the New York Times. Now, again, if we go back to the Cold War, we realize that this is a tactic known as red baiting, and still alive and well. So WSJ tells us to read the New York Times. So what does the New York Times say? Well, I consulted this particular source for about a week, and what I learned is democracy has not prevailed just yet in America. We see it everywhere, but especially in partisan politics. To say that Republicans have doubled down on Trumpism and policies based on Trumpism, I think would be an understatement. And I'm not talking about Republican elected officials, but somewhere between 50 and 60% of Republican voters as well. So this hyper-Trumpism is very healthy at the state level, especially where you see Republicans introducing hundreds of bills designed to restrict and suppress the vote, limit the right to protest, and engage in other forms of speech and political participation. You probably heard about Republicans in Arizona looking for traces of bamboo because they want to find the Chinese fake ballots to prove that the 2020 election was stolen. You also heard President Joe Biden talking about Jim Crow in the 21st century. This was a response to the news in Georgia, which earlier this year was the poster child for, happy Democrats. But keep in mind that both Arizona and Georgia are always moderate compared to Texas, where Republican platform is simply on another level. I won't get into it, but yes, in the New York Times, I also learned that there's this thing called a state voting bill tracker published by Brennan Center for Social Justice. And according to said metric, you have 360 plus bills with restrictive provisions regarding voting in 47 states, 30 of which have passed at least one chamber. And so, you see one party seeking to maintain power despite everything, right? And I guess which is why the New York Times sees gridlock and polarization as sort of relatively good news, right? So why are Republicans doing this? Well, the simple answer is white supremacy above everything else. And Republicans say so themselves. The program, this is the program of the newly established America First Caucus. It's a screenshot from a Twitter thread I got from my colleague. I have a little bibliography at the very end just to show you where I'm getting all this stuff. In fact, you'll see interesting parallels to that Global Times editorial I showed you at the beginning. They say America is a nation with a border and a culture strengthened by a common respect for uniquely Anglo-Saxon political tradition. I mean, that's kind of straight, stuff straight coming out of Beijing. And this is what's absolutely fascinating. The country, you could say this is fringe, but it really isn't. I mean, that's what the GOP is standing for today. And the country they want is not some kind of multi-racial pluralist democracy that, Obama talked about in his various speeches and the Biden-Harris administration officials talk about in the UN. No, it's a democracy designed by white Christian nationalists. I guess that's one technical term sociologists use, or more accurately, white supremacists. And, they've never gone away. Bob showed this Stoddard's book from 1920, and you think that, Du Bois debunked Stoddard's claim in 1929 at that Chicago debate they had. And you'd be wrong, right? These Republicans are making serious changes to rules governing future elections to the point they're willing to risk political violence because they want to live and work in a Herrenvolk democracy. That's a technical term. It comes from sociologist Pierre van den Berghe in 1967. Charles W. Mills has been using it recently and roughly defined it. It refers to a system of government that is democratic for the master race, but oppressive for everyone else. So we know this, right? 1960s were a key period for right-wing thought on race and democracy in the United States because this was a part of a radical right counter-revolution in the face of expanding democracy driven by the racial justice movement. And in some ways, it was very successful. See, under the mass incarceration of Black and brown people since that decade. But at the same time, 1960s are important because you saw a transnational counter-revolution in which the European New Right was reading Gramsci and appropriating his revolutionary ideas. So the idea of the war of position against what they saw as democratic excesses of liberal technocracy. And that war has been constantly waged. And it's now, this is where it gets interesting. Now it's waged within, between, and across states and societies. So the current twist is that we have a situation where you have China's rise and American relative decline. And you have speeches given by Xi Jinping and Trump, respectively, that use the word civilization. And they're very similar. I mean, parallels are remarkable. Take any number of speeches in which civilization is mentioned since 2017, given by these two political figures. And you'll see similarities. They talk about bonds of tradition and culture, right? This is from the Warsaw 2017 speech Trump gave that Michael Anton wrote. from the South and the East. They threatened to erase the bonds of culture, faith, and tradition. He was talking not about Christianity, but about a particular racialized civilization that must be protected from outsiders. So Xi Jinping talks about this in the context of this conference on the dialogue of Asian civilizations in 2019. We must protect ourselves. From whom? Well, from liberal modernity. And so these discourses are not simply there to express some kind of skepticism or hostility to this thing called liberal modernity. It's an advancement. It's an advancement of an alternative order idea, regional or global or national, that reflects and reinforces race and racism and white supremacy in the case of the West, but racialized identities more broadly, the bonds of culture and tradition. And so it's a new constellation, I would say. And where does this leave progressives and I guess politics more generally? Well, I'll leave that question for the Q&A. I just wanted to put it together. And I did say I have some bibliography, and it's here. It's part of some of these research projects are collaborations that I'm engaged in, and I'd be happy to send some papers to people who are interested in this kind of stuff. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you so much, Srdjan. That was really interesting and really complemented the other presentations that we've had so far as well. So, okay, if Bobby is okay, yep. I have to say to our audience that Bobby has been is a hero. He suffered a cycling accident earlier, just a few days ago, and has had some surgery, but he has valiantly and courageously agreed to his commitment to speak today. So, Bobby, you're very welcome. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you, Juvaria, and to invite me for this. Yeah, if I do kind of lapse into la la land in the middle, feel free to interrupt. It was almost a year ago. I think Juvaria introduced me that I'm a professor of management at Bayes Business School. We used to be called Cass Business School. This is the second time in my life in a public forum I'm using the term Bayes Business School. We dropped the name Cass because our ex-benefactor, Sir John Cass, we found out almost exactly a year ago, had made his ill-gotten wealth through the slave trade. He was a director of the Royal African Company, which was a major slave trading organization of the 18th century. It was like a perfect storm a year ago. So that happened around April or May. We dropped the name. Then a week or so later, there was the murder, or should I say more accurately, the public execution of George Floyd in the US. The Black Lives Matter movement switched across the pond. There was a hue and cry on the streets, statues must fall all over the country. Decolonization gathered a whole bunch of momentum. So and we found ourselves as a business school smack right bang in the middle of that. And one of the ways I guess we did, a few of us at a research center we run at the school called Ethos, the Center for Responsible Enterprise, is to say, okay, how do we make this a teachable and a learning moment in terms of our own identity? And we organized this workshop in really short notice, in about maybe 5 days. On a broader aspect, we had two workshops, one last July and a follow-up in January, on decolonizing the business school, and then a more specific one on decolonizing the business school curriculum, right? So we ended up with over 1,000 participants. Our Zoom license crashed, but we got new Zoom licenses. 41 countries. We had about 440 people who actually could get into. So obviously, back in July last year, and even now in January, there seems to be, at least in the business school, some recognition that something is wrong. Business schools are not accused of having any kind of political or racial sensitivities, but obviously there was some kind of rethinking happening, right? And of course, the irony is the universities are workplaces engaged in the ideological production of neocolonialism. So universities have historically been, and in many cases still are, actively complicit with the colonial enterprise. So let's start with that assumption. One thing became very clear, that apart from a few people in working in that field, nobody had a clue what decolonization meant. Everybody wanted to do it, but nobody knew what it was, right? So decolonization means different things to different people. It might mean one thing for a graffiti artist in Palestine, another thing for a South Asian cricket player in Yorkshire, another thing for a Bedouin woman carpet weaver in Jordan. It could mean something else for an African-American academic in Alabama. It could mean something else for a coal miner in South Africa, a Pakistani novelist in New York City, a Kashmiri student in Srinagar, or indigenous peoples in the settler colonies of the Americas and Australia, or for that matter, the CEOs of Google or Microsoft were also technically post-colonial subjects. So one of the things we try to kind of unpack at the workshop is, what does this mean in terms of the business school and its curriculum? So I will not, I promise, note that by point, just one slide. So I just want to go through, I guess, some of the key findings from the workshop. 10 commandments, if you will. First of all, I think it's perhaps important to state that decolonizing the business school has to begin with a critique of the political economy of capitalism, because colonialism was and continues to be integral to capitalism. Yeah. Now, this is the theoretical basis of decoloniality. So when my dean asked me to chair the task force on decolonizing the curriculum, I did mention to him that if people actually read the literature, decoloniality means dismantling the structures of capitalism, which would make for a very interesting but rapidly extinct business school. And I think it would be fantastic if we charge 50 grand for an MBA and then send out our MBA graduates to dismantle global capitalism. But I'm not going to be holding my breath. But if you think about it, the connections between colonialism and capitalism are quite obvious, right? You pick up any high school economics textbook, we talk about the 4 factors of production: land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. Let's just look at land and labor, property rights. They are both inextricably linked with histories of colonialism, histories of invasion, histories of extraction, right? That's the basis of the factors of production. So any process of decolonization has to engage with those historical structures, right? So racial capitalism was talked about earlier, which first emerged in the early 80s, I think, perhaps even earlier. So racial capitalism is about the process of extraction of social and economic value from the bodies of Black people and from the bodies of people of color, right? But again, you pick up our economics textbooks or a business school curriculum or any subject, we won't find that. So the business school curriculum is essentially another vehicle of white supremacy, if you look at kind of stuff we teach. At best, business schools who say they want to decolonize can try and diversify their curriculum by including voices of Black people and people of color. However, diversity is not decolonization. This should be a fairly self-evident proposition. As Angela Davis said, diversity is a difference that makes no difference. Diversity is the change that brings about no change. It is a liberal democratic project of diversity which disavows its own position as a neutral site from which alone diversity can be proclaimed. So it's from this neutral site that diversity is able to regulate difference. Yeah. So diversity creates this abstract equality, whereas decolonization is the project of creating a radical equality, an equality that frees difference from the straitjacket of diversity. Or as one of my Black Lives mates puts it, diversity is for white people. So true diversity needs to go beyond having Black and brown faces on glossy reports. It requires expanding diversity to looking at epistemology and pedagogy as well. It also was evident, and this is true even now, a year and a half, or a year later, after the killing of George Floyd, that the momentum built by Black Lives Matter continues to grow. As I said, we had a lot of interest from across the pond. In the US, business schools were hastily putting together modules on courses on racial justice, and they were all oversubscribed, like within days. 90% of the students wanting to know this are white, right? So there's obviously some appetite to understand what's happening in the business schools. There are also many business school educators who want to engage in conversations, but do not have the opportunity to do so. So as I said, we got this with very little advertising, and we had to exclude Australia and New Zealand because it was 3 o'clock in the morning there. Still a handful of people showed up. There's a lot of movement there as well in the Maori and Aboriginal context. So what became very clear was this, that while most people did not have a clue what decolonisation means, there was certainly an acknowledgement that the status quo has to change. Something has to change. We don't know what it is. We want to understand what that is, right? But we want to move the needle away from the Eurocentrism and towards some understanding of decolonial thought. Sixth commandment, if you will. Genuine engagement in decolonising the business school curriculum requires linking structures of colonialism to the curriculum. Yeah, it's not enough to say I'm passionate about diversity. I care deeply about anti-racism. That has to be backed up by scholarship. Now, this is not an easy task. Yeah, not everybody is willing or capable to do this, especially in the business school. Yeah, our academic staff do not have the theoretical background to engage with concepts from critical race theory, post-colonial thought, decolonial thought, feminist theory, whiteness studies, queer theory. These are not even marginal in our field. They're almost excluded. You don't find any of papers published in our top journals on this field. So it's hard to just suddenly expect that academics are going to start teaching from these concepts, right? A lot of the workshop participants admitted they were suffering from an imposter syndrome as to how do, as a white male, patriarchal, heterosexual person, even begin to engage with these kind of debates, right? But again, it's important to link it to the curriculum. For example, we have these principles of scientific management, going back more than 100 years, Frederick Taylor's principles, which are even used today to regulate productivity of workers. Now, the principles of scientific management were directly derived from the plantation. Yeah. So to increase the productivity of the slaves, plantation owners held small contests. So slaves who picked the most cotton were awarded some cash prizes, right? But then that particular production target, which was incentivized, became the minimum they had to produce every day. And that minimum was also used to calculate how many lashes of the whip they would get if they did not meet that target, right? It's your classic scientific management. Again, you won't find that in any of our textbooks or any of our journals, right? So when I teach issues on CSR, sustainability, corporate social responsibility, and I look at some of the continuities in the plantation economy and today's economy. So today, 6 of the 10 largest corporations in the world are oil companies, right? The wealth of every single one of these corporations has been created through dispossession, killings, and violence, and continues to this day. This is not in some colonial era. It is happening as we speak, right? And again, we don't find too many of those kind of case studies in our textbooks, right? So I look at, for example, how wealth is created in the first world, right? Apart from looting and dispossession and extraction, and then how that kind of cycle of extraction continues in the post-colonial era. Anti-racism cannot be framed as a diversity project without understanding the colonial structures of racial injustice that created the slave trade. So just as historical slavery was an enabling condition of industrial capitalism, modern slavery is an enabling condition of global neoliberal capitalism. So the ILO released a report in 2017, and they claim that there are more slaves today than when slavery was legal. According to the ILO report, there's 40.3 million slaves. It's a very conservative estimate. The number could be at least 2 or 3 times that. It is also a very profitable business. 2016 profit figures, just profit figures in 2016 for modern slavery was $150 billion. Again, hardly a word in any of our textbooks. The structural consequences of colonialism need to be taught in our classrooms in relation to present-day problems like climate change, economies of extraction, and dispossession. So I teach a module on climate change. It's more about climate justice. So why is it that the countries whose resources have been looted for the past 200 years, who are contributing the least to the problem of global warming, of emissions, are the ones who are going to suffer the most? So this is a new form of carbon colonialism. So we in the West, we want our cheap shit, we export our pollution elsewhere, and then we penalize those who are producing that cheap stuff for us because they're emitting CO2, right? So this is another form of extraction and dispossession. And also in the name of saving the world, certain people of color have to be sacrificed first, I guess. There will be a backlash against decolonization. Let me rephrase that. There is a backlash against decolonization. For those of you outside the UK, there's been a major scandal here in the University of Leicester. About 35 or 40 people have already now lost their jobs. And they were focused precisely based on their research on critical management studies, what they call teaching business from a political economy perspective. And I guess finally, my recommendation to the business school leaders was, if you do not accept this, then it is not possible for the business school to be decolonized. So the obvious question is, in conclusion, can these structures be dismantled within business schools, which are workplaces, as I said, engaged in the ideological production of neocolonialism? No, it cannot. Just as Spivak's subaltern cannot speak, the business school cannot be decolonized. Yes, statues must fall, names will change, but that is not enough. Yeah, these are necessary, but not sufficient conditions in understanding how racism works and understanding how institutional racism continues to operate today. So undermining and understanding how colonialism and imperialism, which are justified by the Enlightenment ideals that Europeans hold so dear, is the basis of racist structures of today's society. So decolonization is not a metaphor. It is not a bandwagon to fix other societal problems. Yeah, it's not just about improving living conditions in the current system. That's not decolonization. It calls for a systematic and dismantling of Western knowledge structures that produce knowledge of the other, a knowledge that is claimed to be authentic, a knowledge that is claimed to be original, without a recognition that this knowledge is produced through the political economy of colonialism. Nearly 40 years ago, the Black feminist writer, poet, and activist Audre Lorde famously said, "The master's tools will never destroy the master's house." That is true, but as far as decolonization is concerned, the master's tools are equality, diversity, and inclusion. Those tools will never destroy the master's house. But if our masters, and here's, I guess, where the intervention is, and by masters, I mean the power structures of our business schools, of our universities, power structures that are almost exclusively white, male, heterosexual, and patriarchal. If these power structures have opened the door of the house, just a little bit, yeah, let's use whatever intellectual tools we have to break the whole goddamn door down. The we being Black people, people of color, indigenous peoples, and their white accomplices. Why? Because as the Black Lives Matter movement says, that's not a chip on my shoulder, that's your foot on my neck. As the post-colonial migrants say, we are here because you were there. Or as the indigenous peoples in the settler colonies say, we were always here. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope we have some time for some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Bobby. That's a really excellent presentation. Very interesting and very thought-provoking. And I guess we have some questions in, well, one question in the chat, in the Q&A at the moment, but I just wonder if I could pick up from where Bobby kind of left us and maybe ask our guest speakers more generally, in the context of these massive challenges, which each of you has identified in regard to the vaccine and vaccine nationalism and the racialized character of that distribution. And then with Bob's thing about geopolitics and race, and Srdjan's sort of contestations around white supremacy and the ethnocentrism claims made by US and China about each other. Do you think is the role of us as scholars in our university positions in tackling these kinds of issues, and not only as difficult issues, intellectual issues, but as political issues as well? And secondly, in the context that we as academics are also heavily responsible for the employability of our students. That is, we are fashioning them intellectually in various ways, or engaging them in various kinds of debates and ideas and so on. But at the same time, we are also preparing them for the workforce. That is to say, employment in the very economy that we hold so problematic in pretty much every one of the presentations that we've had. So how do we navigate our way through this kind of a position? I wonder if Zophia might want to start us off on that.
Sure, thank you for that really great question. I think that in how I think about this question in terms of our role as academics, I kind of go back to the Black radical scholars who I've cited and how they think about that role. And I think we're very clear on the fact that academics need to abandon their middle class sensibilities and allegiances and join forces with the liberation movements and work with liberation movements and commit to liberation movements. And I mean, Amilcar Cabral even used the term class suicide, right? That there's really, as Bobby's saying, the efforts that the universities want to engage in, diversity and language of inclusion and these sort of tokenistic, symbolistic ways of answering the call for decolonization, but not really. I think it's helpful to think about it in that way, right? That we really need to think about ways in which we can advocate, push for, join the broader liberation struggle, the broader racialized working class struggles for a new world, a new society, a new social order. And I think specifically what that looks like, I think is, like you said, you know, you're training the next generation of scholars, but also finding ways to channel resources from the universities to the community, because universities hoard so much resources in so many ways. So how we can do that. But I think there is fundamentally an incompatibility in that. It's a contradiction. And you know, if we follow Amilcar Cabral, the only way to solve this is to complete class suicide. So I'll leave it there.
All right. So that effectively is to kind of, yeah. So activism and scholarship are actually completely and utterly interconnected with one another, and that is one logical way to see it. I just wonder, perhaps we could take one of other guests, maybe Bob, you want to have a pitch in on this?
I don't think I'm the right person for that. You know, I'm 66 years old and feeling more and more cynical and devalued and demoralized. And so my strategy is exit. So I don't know. I don't know how to answer this. And I will say this, though, one of the things that has, driven me crazy is how, well, you heard the talk I just gave, and I talked about the left and their views about these matters. And I cannot tell you how much resistance there is to wrestling with what I've had to say in some kind of constructive way. Basically, I just get all sorts of pushback and so forth. I expect that on the right, but not on the left. So I am demoralized at present and old. So I am punting by turning it over to younger scholars in a way. I'm sorry for that answer, but it's a truthful one.
Okay, fair. You're not old, by the way, Robert. You're a young man, and you're vigorous, and the intellectual power that you deliver through your presentation belies that kind of comment. But I understand that. I think you have taken on quite a large challenge, and I wonder whether or not, actually, just thinking about your presentation, whether the sort of the way in which you've framed the left's view, perhaps is maybe a little abrasive, in the sense that you didn't deny the importance of oil and oil flows as a key factor in the way in which the world economy works, for example. And that doesn't necessarily, we can recognize that, and that the control of such resources does bestow power. The ability to sanction oil producing states does bestow some degree of an attempt to control the behavior of those states, as do other kind of controlling other commodities through sanctions. So it's not that you're saying that oil isn't a powerful factor in world economy or world politics, but you are embedding it in a particular kind of analysis, which says that there are sort of powerful racial kind of understandings which are embedded within those kinds of discourses about those resources as well. So is there a fundamental kind of contradiction there?
I'm going to argue that I don't want to take this over because I learned so much from my colleagues here. I'm not so sure oil matters all that much, save that people want to believe it does. And nowhere is that more powerful than on the left, because, as I said, it confirms what has always been central to their ethos from back in the day when oil companies were actually in charge of, but not just oil companies. Think about plantations and other firms in other sectors. When the firms kind of dominated production, they just believe that the project is to control these things. I guess when you read my book, you'll see that we actually don't control these things. Sure. There is no control as it's sometimes imagined. Brzezinski believed this, and on the opposite side of Brzezinski is Noam Chomsky, who also believes it with precisely the same framing as Brzezinski. But I've tried to demonstrate why factually it can't, these arguments can't be falsified, and or where they can be falsified, they've been falsified over and over again. So we'll leave it for another time, because there are much smarter people here than me. So
all right, sure, no problem. Srdjan, I wonder if you would like to pitch in.
I mean, I like a lot what Zophia was saying, but I of course understand what Bob is saying too. There's voice exit loyalty trilemma at all times for all of us. I think the difference maker is the classroom where I teach. I teach mostly Canadians, many international students. Most of them have been well educated in anti-racist progress, and the stories thereof, that progress has been real over the course of Canadian history or world history. To deny it would be to deny the success of all the amazing activists and intellectuals that were mentioned in this workshop, who challenge colonization, slavery, who are challenging poverty, who are challenging vaccine segregation, and who are challenging the radical right today, which is what I was talking about. But I think what many students do not understand is how misleading it is to frame it in the language of contradictions, inconsistency, double vision, some of the words I use in my presentations, because these characterizations presuppose that there was indeed a genuine intention to include everybody as a rights-bearing individual, right? Which is a liberal story, right? Well, how can this intention be reconciled with conquest, colonial rule, imperial elimination, slavery, etc., right? So it cannot, it's absurd. So we should acknowledge and formally recognize the consistency between a racialized, divided ethic and a set of norms for what it is. And that's this thing called racial liberalism. And I spent a lot of time teaching about this. And it's obviously, I mentioned the name Charles W. Mills earlier, and that's informed directly by his work on Black radical liberalism. And I try to at least introduce students to that. If you want to be a progressive, if you want to call yourself liberal, then maybe pay attention to actual the non-monolithic nature of liberalism. And I know it's small. I know it doesn't really advance decolonization or anything else. But maybe step by step, eventually we're going to have a wide enough coalition that's going to bring about structural change, which means massive affirmative action, massive redistribution of wealth and those kinds of things. A lot of people in the United States are hopeful. I'm not. I think things will get worse before they get better.
Thank you, Srdjan. There's a little bit of hope in some sort of movement, but I will now sort of stop asking my questions, although I have a few more. But let's go to the Q&A. Professor Atul Shah talks about racial neutrality in political economy, and he argues that in his own area, in business and finance research and education, cultural neutrality allegedly operates in that field. And he asks, why are these salient truths, the fact that it's not racially neutral political economy, why are those sort of truths routinely suppressed? And I guess in a way you've answered that kind of a question, but I just wonder whether, Bobby, maybe you want to have a go at that one.
Well, I think we've kind of addressed that. This is the whole notion of how the discipline is structured, based on particular racial and colonial histories. The culture is being taught from one perspective. I just want to kind of go back to the earlier argument about, yes, I do share, I'm as old as you, Robert, and I do share your cynicism, or should I say realism. But yeah, I also agree with the other speaker about the issues in the classroom. So I don't see my role as educating the next generation of CEOs. There are many people better than me doing that. So I see my role as educating the next generation of political leaders, of activists, who are also going to be in business, right? So that's one way, I guess, we can make a role in the classroom. And again, to bring the racial element back into this, about the structures, I don't mean to sound insensitive, but I mean, what is the COVID death rate as of today? 3 million, 4 million? I don't know how many we've crossed in a year and a few months of COVID. Last year, 4 million children died of hunger. There's a vaccine for that. It's called food. Next year, 5 million people will die of hunger, children. Every year, between 4 to million children die of hunger. Where is the outrage? Where are the candlelight vigils? These are black and brown people dying on the other side of the continent. If these were 4 million white European kids dying of hunger, you think we'd have the same reaction? So let's put some things in perspective on when we talk about a global pandemic and global death toll, the globe is still very much dictated by people who call the shots.
Thank you. Got a question from one of our students at City. And I guess I can kind of frame it from Mazzino Gold in a way. He basically is saying that given these kind of very powerful structures of white power, effectively, white institutional power and advantage and racial oppression, he asks, can we really expect any real level of what he calls true decolonization, racial justice or intersectionality? And I just want to, ask you to address that question, but also say that when we talk about the 18th century and the 19th century, and even the early part of the 20th century, we have very different global conditions and conditions within the core states as well. That is to say, we have now diversity in the power elite, for example. You have groups of people represented within the power elites in Western European, North American countries, which are not there, say, 40 or 50 or 60 years ago. Some have reached very high positions. Secondly, the way in which the world as a whole relates, there are very powerful elites in global South countries, which are deeply embedded in the power structures, which may still be dominated by global North elites, but who are living very different kinds of lives, even though their ethnicities and racial makeup and so on is exactly the same. So I guess for Mazzino's asking whether we can expect any kind of major change, and I'm arguing that there has been major change over the last 200 years and the last 60 years as well. And are we saying that that change is just now basically grinding to a halt, that there isn't any kind of pathway forward?
Very quickly, yes. The structural changes we've been seeing are essentially and are consolidates the power structures. As Cornel West said, it's not just about having black faces in high places, right? When the structures go unacknowledged. Let's not forget, Black Lives Matter started under a black president. So just to have a black face is not going to change the structural racism. You need to have an understanding of the racial politics. So again, I'm talking from the UK context. Does Preeti Patel represent the interests of marginalized women of color in this country? Hell no. We've got the race commissioner who's a black man, who claims there is no structural racism in this country. So just having a face is not going to do it, because these are faces which do not speak to power, but which are very much kind of interpolated by power structures.
But nevertheless, it is a big change in contrast with what we were living in 50 years ago, 60 years ago, when openly you could advertise for jobs and ask no black person to apply. You could openly put in front of your house rooms for rent except for racial minorities or whatever it is. So are you saying that nothing has changed? And therefore, that there isn't any future possibilities of further change, partly as a result of the kind of mass movements which have catapulted universities into lots of positions that we are now occupying this year. You know, decolonizing the curriculum was there, but it took a big boost as a result of what happened post George Floyd and the protests which occurred. And I guess it goes to Zophia's point, which is that perhaps as scholars, we can only really be effective if we do try to align and sort of play a much more important role within those kind of mass movements and for those mass movements than just sort of outside of it and only trying to reform our own particular institutions through internal processes. I don't know. I mean, I'm genuinely grappling with that kind of an issue and a question.
I guess I will just add to Bobby's point, because I definitely agree that, you know, just having these diverse faces within these positions doesn't mean that the structures are changing or that the ideologies are changing, because there were many Black slave owners, right? For instance, in Trinidad and Tobago, which is the context I do my research on, there were Black slave owning people who forced those people to work on plantations. And so I think this tiny group of Black faces or, elites, if we look at, for instance, the list of billionaires in the world, it's still predominantly white. And, if you compare 1960s, the percentage of Black faculty in colleges and universities, it hasn't changed much from the 1960s to today. So I feel like what seems like progress is very much still within this racial capitalist system where, as the student said, these white supremacists and exploitative structures are not changing. They're finding, well, I should say, they are changing because they're becoming, they innovate, right? So we don't have plantation slavery anymore, but we're doing, in the US, there's mass incarceration and super exploitation of prison labor. And so it finds new ways to innovate and create and new ways of exploiting. So, you know, the few faces that we see that have entered into that amalgam, I think, you know, it's more about what are those groups doing rather than they're there, they're just there.
Thank you. We're pretty much out of time. I still have one question which I hope to address to you. And we speak about racial capitalism, and clearly capitalism is the two are deeply embedded with one another, and you've shown that very, very clearly in your presentations and so on. But at the same time, there is exploitation of the labor of you know, white workers as well as non-white workers and so on. And I just wonder, I mean, and one of the big kind of things in terms of motivating protest, organization, and to protest oppression and injustice and inequality clearly does come from oppressed white people as well. So what role do you see in regard to, you know, are we saying that it's just white privilege, and therefore white privilege means that's the end of that? You can't do anything with that group of people. Yet last year on the streets of the United States and so many countries as well, after Floyd, there are more white people, as I saw in the news clips, protesting that police violence and so on, than there were non-white people, for example. So I'm just wondering, so within that capitalism, we have classes. What role does class as a force play, which is encompassing of different racial groups, as opposed to just racial minorities? Anybody?
I mean, I don't want to monopolize, so I'll talk very briefly, but I think this is exactly why I think the scholars who pay attention to the intersection of race and class are really, really important here, right? Because they say that you can only really understand these exploitations and solidarities, potential for solidarities, by you can't look at class alone. You have to look at the intersection of race and class. And then of course, people like Claudia Jones and Angela Davis and the Black feminists who say, and gender too. And so I think from the literature, we can see that, and as we've seen this playing out right now, is that yes, white workers are exploited, but nowhere near the levels of exploitation that we see for other racialized workers. And, you know, if for any sector that you look at, white workers will be getting a certain salary and everybody else is getting a salary far below that for the same job. And so it's these layers of exploitation and also commitments to white supremacy that play into why we don't see the solidarities that we should expect. And I would also say in this Black Lives Matter moment, where we did see a lot of multiracial organizing, it is also in that very moment that we see, you know, rapid rise in white nationalism and white supremacist extremism. And, you know, Biden barely won the election. So I think it's not enough. That's why I think it's not enough to look at class only, and that we have to look at the intersection of both to understand why, you know, this sort of multiracial liberation organizing has not historically happened and isn't happening on a wide scale.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Zophia, for that. Okay, we are now gone over time. So unless anyone would like to say a few words to sort of sum up any of their approaches to these questions, or you want to add anything, Srdjan or Robert? I think Bobby's had enough. Poor guy. We can say, I just say thank you so much to you all for your spending your Friday morning, afternoon with us, contributing your thoughts and ideas and your work. Plenty of things to think about. So thank you so much to Srdjan and to Robert and to Zophia and to Bobby as well. And also thank you, of course, to our audience for bearing with us as well. So we'll be back next week. We're going to look at the kind of global implications of the Iraq War, or the two Iraq wars, the Gulf War and the Iraq War, as well as take a dive into Iraqi society and the impacts of the war on that country. So we're back next Friday at 4 p.m. But for today, thank you so much again to our speakers. Have a lovely weekend and stay safe and well. And thank you to, of course, to Juvaria, who does so much work for us, and to Tanya, who behind the scenes makes it all happen. So keep in touch and see you again soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.